Life is and can be a very, very dangerous thing. There's a lot of sources of fear. Nature can pose various threats, from natural disasters to pestilence and famine and drought, or global pandemics and diseases. There's all sorts of natural reasons and natural threats that we can worry about. And then on top of just the natural possibilities and dangers that are out there, there are the human dangers. There are all sorts of evils that are perpetrated throughout the world, and this has always been the case throughout history. There are nations and empires that have often wreaked havoc upon the world through their violence and through their empire building, or just from the various violence that we see all around us or hear about on the news. There's so many violent threats against the weak, against the defenseless, really against everybody. And so if we really stop and think about it, or let ourselves think about it, we might be a little overwhelmed and even afraid by simply how fragile life can be. And we can find a lot of reasons to be afraid if we want to. And that is difficult considering the fact that over and over again, in fact, I've read some people say that the single most numerous command in Scripture is do not be afraid. I don't know if it's the most numerous command or not. I've not counted them up to check, but I do know it's found again and again and again throughout Scripture, the command and the exhortation to not be afraid. And so the question is, in the midst of a life that is so dangerous, in the midst of all the dangers that can possibly beset us, how in the world, or why in the world, should we reject fear in the face of such obvious and catastrophic danger? And we get an answer in many places in the Bible, but Psalm 46 is a psalm that answers that question about why we need not fear. And so let's begin by simply reading that psalm together. Psalm 46, to the choir master of the sons of Korah, according to Alamoth, a psalm. Verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations rage, the kingdoms totter, he utters his voice, and the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. As I said, I know at least one of those lines in that psalm is very recognizable. The song that we sing quite frequently is the song, Be Still and Know. There's many other songs that have been written from this. One of the most famous was written by Martin Luther back in the 1500s. I think a version of that is in one of our books. It's A Mighty Fortress is Our God. There's several other hymns that were written through the 1800s, but we probably know that one, Be Still and Know, the most. But that is kind of the culmination of the psalm, that line that we know, the command, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But it is the culmination of understanding who God is and why he is who we can place our trust in, that we find that command to be still. So as we start looking at this psalm, we'll just kind of take a look at a couple of basic things. I don't want to get down into the weeds about this, but as we've gone through various psalms, we often try and classify psalms. There's praise psalms and thankful psalms and psalms of petition. And this one is one of those that's a little bit difficult to categorize because it kind of mixes a few different genres and it lacks some elements of other types of psalms. But one of the types of psalms that it's been described as is a Zion psalm. There are multiple psalms that are about Zion or about Jerusalem, or Jerusalem, especially in a spiritual sense, describing the home of God or the dwelling place of God. But it's also a psalm of confidence or a psalm of trust. And as a Zion psalm, we may not live in Jerusalem, and I don't think that we have to visit Jerusalem, but I think this psalm points to something greater than just literal Jerusalem. It is the true Zion. And it is, therefore, a psalm of confidence or trust that teaches us how to trust and why we can trust in the Lord. Now, the background for this psalm, we're not given anything specifically, either in the heading or throughout the psalm itself, that specifies beyond doubt when this psalm was written. There's a few different ideas about when it could have been written. Many commentators tend to think that it was perhaps written during the time of Assyria's empire, when Assyria was a world power, and Assyria, of course, had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And maybe even it's talking about the time when Assyria was besieging Jerusalem, or immediately thereafter. And if so, there's some interesting parts of this psalm that might tie directly to some of those events. But really, it could be written at any point in Israel's history, showing whenever the nation was threatened by any type of Gentile nation or faced whatever threats they may have faced. It was a psalm that could have been written and used again and again to teach God's people to trust in Him, not to trust in foreign military powers, not to trust in themselves, but to trust in the protection of God Almighty. So as we try and outline this psalm, and there's various ways you can outline it if you look at different commentaries, but I think a good outline is to divide the psalm up into three different parts. First of all, you have the first three verses, which I would title Refuge from Roaring Waters. In these first three verses, we have nature scenes. We have the seas and the mountains and the earth in tumult, and yet even though the earth itself seems to be shaken, and we see these perhaps natural disasters that might be metaphors of other things, but very natural language, we see that even in those times, God is a refuge. And then verses 4 through 7 make up the next section, which I would call a fortress against raging nations. After the psalmist talks about nature and the earth, the seas and the mountains, now he moves to speaking about nations and kingdoms and empires. And these can be even more tumultuous than the earth, of course, and they can present a great deal of danger and difficulty. And yet, God is a fortress for His people. And then in verses 8 through 11, these ideas are combined. You actually have both elements of the earth and also the elements of the armies and the nations. And what we see is God has been a refuge and He has been a fortress. And so they're all combined in verses 8 through 11, and we simply see the exaltation of God. And this is an important part of the psalm. I think you see this throughout the Psalter. While there is so much about what God has done for us, while there is so much about why we can trust in Him, we always have to remember to not become too selfish with the way we look at things, and remember that while God is our refuge, and that is an incredible benefit, the end goal is not just simply our safety, but it is the glorification and the exaltation of God. And it's when we trust in God, and when we exalt Him, and when we obey Him in our life, that we can then trust in His protection and His care and His final and complete exaltation over all things. Now, also within this outline, in each of these sections, I think there's some interesting things that we see as far as our response or what God does for us and God's strength and power. One of those is we will not fear. Now, in the psalm, you'll see there's a lot of reasons to fear, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's wars and oppressive armies. But the psalmist says, we will not fear. Because of God's strength and because God is a refuge, we can overcome fear. We can be courageous in the face of great danger. But not only will we not be afraid, but we can even be glad. I think that's an amazing part of this psalm. It's a very simple and short part. But in this psalm that's filled with danger and terror, not only are we called to courage, we are promised gladness. Now, I can't imagine. I'm so thankful that I don't live in a war-torn area. Sometimes we see news stories of other countries that are living in terrible conditions because of the war that is taking place. Can you imagine living in an area that was just decimated by evil men and their violence as they sought control and power, and yet being, one, courageous in the midst of that danger, but two, being able to find joy and gladness in the midst of that danger? Now, God doesn't promise us joy and gladness in this life, by simply taking away all of the dangers. But God's people on this earth can have joy and can have gladness, even in the midst of trouble, even during difficult trials, even when there are all sorts of disasters around us. We can find gladness in the provision of God. And then we also see in verses 8 through 11, we see, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit more, but we see an invitation and a command. One is to behold, to come and see. We can see through the Scripture and through our lives the wonderful works of God, and thus we have the command to be still, an acknowledgement of who God is. And we'll talk about what that idea of be still means. Now, one thing I also want to point out here in this outline before we move on is if you'll take a look at verses 7 and 11, you'll notice that those are identical. They say the exact same things, and so this verse is repeated. And many commentators note that this is what we might consider a refrain, or what we would often call a chorus. We're used to choruses in many of the songs we sing. You may sing a verse and then you sing the chorus or the refrain. You sing another verse and you sing the same chorus or refrain. And that seems like what that may be. Now, Hebrew poetry didn't work the exact same way that our songs typically do. And so we may wonder why there's not a refrain with verses 1 through 3. Some commentators used to think that maybe there was and it got lost. I don't think that's the case. I actually think that verse 1 is the refrain, and obviously differing than what we are accustomed to. It comes at a different point. We don't have verse, refrain, verse, refrain. We actually have refrain, verse, verse, refrain, and it's also slightly different. But when you look at what it says, it's the exact same idea. God is our refuge and strength. The end of the refrain in verses 7 and 11, the God of Jacob is our fortress. And so this idea of refuge or a fortress. And then in verse 1, a very present help in trouble. And the opening part of verses 7 and 11, the Lord of hosts is with us. And so it's inverted, it's placed before the verse, but it's the exact same idea. And that really is the main theme of this entire psalm that's repeated in the examples and then in the refrains is one, God's presence and God's help, and the fact that God is a refuge or a fortress to protect his people. And so if you really want to boil down this psalm, it is about the Lord's protection and the Lord's presence and all the blessings that brings for his people. So we're going to just look at this. We won't get real detailed in all of these, but we'll break this up and look at these 3 sections together. So let's look at verses 1 through 3. Now, first of all, there's a few things right here in verse 1 that we're told God is. One of the things that I enjoy immensely about studying the Psalms that's very helpful to me as I've studied the Psalms is how much we can learn about God in the Psalter. And as Christians, we should want to be learning about God, who he is, what he is like, how he thinks, what he wants from us. And in the Psalms, we see this over and over again. We see descriptions about God. We see praises of God. We see metaphors that help teach us visually what God is like. And in this psalm, we find the same thing. We find some great truths about who God is. First of all, we're told that God is a refuge. Now, a refuge is simply a shelter. It's something that protects you from other people, or it's something that can protect you from the elements. You might think in the Old Testament, remember when the Israelites were coming into the land of Canaan, they were told to set up 6 cities of refuge. What was the purpose of those cities? If you remember, those cities were set aside so that if someone accidentally killed another person, not by premeditated murder, but by an accident. Let's say they were working and they mishandled something and they accidentally killed one of their neighbors or one of their fellow men. In order to escape the vengeance and wrath of that person's family who may want to seek vengeance, they were told to go to a city of refuge. And as long as they remained in that city of refuge, they were harbored, they were protected. It was illegal for anybody to come in and to forcibly take them out or to take their life. It was a place of safety. It was a place that protected them. Also, a refuge is something that might be helpful as protection against the elements or storms. In Isaiah 4, verse 6, he describes God in this way. He says, there will be a booth for shade by day from the heat, and for a refuge and a shelter from the storm and the rain. A refuge is a shelter that protects. I know Like in Missouri, where we grew up, and sometimes around here, it's not uncommon for people to have what they call storm shelters, whether they consider that their basement or they build something extra into their garage or in the ground. But they have this shelter that is meant to be a place of safety, a place of refuge that protects them even against some of the worst weather imaginable. And we are told that God is our refuge. He is a place of safety and a place of protection. But he is also called our strength. And when you think about it, where does fear come from? Why are we afraid? We are afraid when we are weak. If you are strong enough to overcome whatever the difficulty is, there's not really a lot of reason to be afraid, is there? You know, when we just look out our window and we see a very light rain, just a little bit of a sprinkle, we're not very afraid of that, are we? Why? Because we know that our houses and our shelters are stronger than the lack of wind, and they're stronger than that little bit of a sprinkle. There's strength, and so there's no need to be afraid. But when we see that rain start coming down heavily, and we can hear the wind howling, and we know that there's a potential for tornado or other severe weather, then we begin to worry and be afraid. Why? Because we know that sometimes those winds and those storms can be so strong that they're stronger than even the 2x4s and the roofs and the windows that we have on our house. There's a weakness that can be exploited by those storms. Or think of an army. If an army of 10,000 soldiers goes up against an army of 10, that army of 10,000, the men in that army probably aren't going to be very afraid, are they? Because they have overwhelming strength compared to that other army. And it wouldn't matter how great of soldiers those 10 men were, they would surely be terrified because they would be very weak in comparison with the enemy. So fear comes from weakness. And this is why in the psalm we're told that we don't have to be afraid because God is our strength. You see, when I have to rely on my own strength, even if I am very strong physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever it may be, there are going to come times in this life when my strength is simply not enough. There are going to come times when I am not strong enough to endure, when I am not strong enough to overcome. Now, the strongest individuals that have ever lived have also died. It doesn't matter how great our diet is. It doesn't matter how far we can run. It doesn't matter how much we can lift and how great of shape we're in. At some point, time is going to be proven to be stronger than we are. And age will deteriorate our body and we will succumb to death. Or people are strong, but a car wreck is able to damage them or even kill them. We have weaknesses, but God is our strength. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how great God's greatness is displayed. But what a wonder to know that we don't have to rely on our strength. We don't have to rely on our ability, but we can take comfort in knowing that God is our strength. And thus we can overcome any fears. Now, the first time that this word appears, this idea of strength, comes on an interesting point. It actually comes in Moses, the Song of Moses, immediately following the destruction of Pharaoh's army, which I think is something pictured, as we'll see a little later in this very psalm. It seems like the psalmist may have been drawing from that event when Israel was spared and delivered from Pharaoh's army by God's closing of the Red Sea upon Pharaoh's army. But in Exodus 15, verse 2, is the first time the word strength is used, this Hebrew word, and it says, "The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him." And when you look at that verse, it's almost Psalm 46 in miniature. We find the very beginning, the strength of God. We see him saving, and then we see God being exalted. That's exactly, if you remember, what we see just prolonged throughout 11 verses in Psalm 46. But that's a wonderful picture to explain the comfort that comes from the Lord being our strength. I'm sure that the Israelites were terrified. In fact, when we read that story in Exodus, we know that they were terrified. They were a nation of slaves. They were a nation that was used to being oppressed. They didn't know how to fight. And although they had been rejoicing when they were spared and they got to leave Egypt, we know that Pharaoh's heart changed, and he comes after them, and he has his entire army. And he has hundreds of chariots at his disposal. It wouldn't take Pharaoh's army long to run down even this massive group of people with all of his military might. If Israel was to rely upon her strength alone, their freedom was going to be very short-lived. And yet, when the morning dawned and they looked back on that sea and they watched it close over Pharaoh's army, they watched the strength of God overcome the most powerful army in the world at that point to deliver and to save them. God was their strength. And thankfully, God is ours as well. But not only is God a refuge and a strength, but he is a very present help in trouble. Now, a refuge is a wonderful place, but a refuge is only as helpful as it is accessible. Now, if you're driving down the highway and a tornado hits, you may have the world's best storm shelter at your house. But if you're 30 minutes away from that storm shelter, what good is that refuge going to do? None. If you can't get to the shelter, it will not save you. If you're trying to get to the city of refuge, but you dilly-dally and allow the avenger of blood to catch up, safety would have been there in the city, but it's no longer accessible. And yet, when we talk about God, not only is God the perfect refuge, not only is he perfect in strength, but he is accessible. He is always near. He is a refuge that we can always turn to and is always ready to protect his people. Several verses allude to the nearness of the Lord and his salvation. Psalm 145, verse 8, "The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth." Now that verse, and along with the understanding in Psalm 46, is God is there, he is present, he is near to us, and he is able to save. But we also have to call on him in truth. We have to call upon him in faithfulness. We have to turn to him in submission and in obedience. But when we do, he is always ready to save. Deuteronomy 4, verse 7, "For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him?" And James 4, verse 8, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." What a wonderful promise from James that for us as Christians as well, God is near to us. And thus he is an ever very present help in times of trouble. I'm thinking of those times of trouble. It's one thing to sing about God's power when all is well, when everything is sunshine and we're healthy and there's no danger around. It's another thing entirely to trust in God's power and protection when disaster seems to be bearing down upon us. And in these verses, the psalmist describes trouble in, again, natural ways. He talks about the earth giving way. He talks about the mountains being moved into the heart of the sea. The heart of the sea would be the very depth, the very center of the sea. Even though it talks about waters that are roaring and foaming, though mountains are trembling at its swelling. And there's a couple of ideas about what may be pictured here. Perhaps it is literal disasters that are being talked about. This could include things like earthquakes, volcanic activity, tsunamis, floods, things that are devastating. When you look at oceans and land, land seems to be so permanent. Mountains seem to be so constant. And yet, what's even more constant? The sea. Coastlines change all the time, especially over time, because as permanent as land seems, you put the power of surges and waves against land, and that sea will continue to erode that landmass. It can cause landslides. There have been huge changes in topography because of landslides, and earthquakes, and other disasters. And so the picture may very well be these natural disasters that seem so threatening. But even if they are literal, surely they stand figuratively as well for what will be discussed later in the psalm. Because just as the earth and mountains would depict consistency, the sea would depict chaos. And the raging sea eroding the earth and toppling mountains is an apt picture of the chaos that often happens amongst humanity. Of times when it seems that, as we would say, when the world is turned upside down by disasters or by men. I'm thankful that many of us, most of us, have not lived, at least in this country, in times that typically feel this way. But think about parts of history when it did, or it would have felt like the world was turned upside down because of the violence of men, because of dangers. We did live through a global pandemic that sure seemed to turn things upside down. Those are frightening times. And yet the call is for us to not fear, because even in these times, even in the most tumultuous upending of times, we have strength in God, we have refuge in God, and He is present for us and with us. Also, this isn't necessarily right here in the psalm, but seeing this idea of the sea versus the mountains, it also makes me think of something that Jesus once said on the opposite end, that just goes to explain the power that God has and demonstrates for His people. Remember Jesus in Matthew 21, verse 21, when the disciples, this is in the event when Jesus had cursed the fig tree, and the disciples saw it the next day and saw that just because of Jesus' word, this tree had withered. And Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has seen and done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen." It's the opposite of what the psalmist talks about, where the sea is dangerous and it's toppling the solid things. Sometimes the solid, constant things are the things that oppose. Sometimes it seems like our enemies, or those that would oppose the Lord, are so strong. Jesus says, if you have the faith of that, just of a mustard seed, as He would say in another place, you can remove the greatest of obstacles. Now, again, is that because of our power? No. It's because of the strength of God. But then as we move to verses 4 through 7, we find a transition from natural scenes to mankind. And instead of, but before that, we still have a body of water that's important. We move from the raging and the foaming sea to a peaceful river. Now, this is an interesting verse, and it's caused a lot of speculation because it speaks about a river making glad the city of God. And typically the city of God would be considered Jerusalem. But there is no and ever has been a river in Jerusalem. In fact, that's one of the difficulties and challenges that Jerusalem had when they were besieged. That could get dangerous very quickly because they didn't have a source of water like a river, at least a large source like a river, to depend upon. And so a river, or those inhabitants of Jerusalem, would especially have to rely upon God and His ability to deliver them. So a river has always been, in the Bible, used to depict God's presence and provision. In Psalm 65, verse 9, it says this, "You visit the earth and water it, you greatly enrich it. The river of God is full of water. You provide their grain, for so you have prepared it." This idea of life-giving water from the river of God is something that is found throughout the entire narrative, the entire story of Scripture. And even in times of danger and devastation, God provides for His people. Again, this is shown to us throughout the whole Bible. When we go back to the Garden of Eden, remember, there was a river there. And Genesis 2, verse 10, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. Later on in Ezekiel chapter 47, you can go read that chapter later. We won't read it all right now. But Ezekiel pictures a temple. If you remember, Ezekiel he had been carried off. He was a captive in Babylon. He was from the priestly tribe, but he never probably got to work in the temple because he was carried off before he would have been able to. And some of his message is about the coming destruction of the temple, which would have been devastating news to the Jewish people. It would have been a devastating message for a priest to have to deliver. But the end of Ezekiel's prophecy ends with this grand and glorious vision of a future temple. And there's a lot that goes into that. But in that picture of this temple that he is allowed to see, he describes a river. Now, it doesn't begin as a river, but it comes out from the temple, and it grows, and it gets to where it's knee deep, and then it's waist deep, and then it's so big and powerful that you can't cross it, and it becomes this life-giving river flowing from the temple, which represents God's presence. And then at the end of the Bible, of course, in Revelation 22, verse 1, as John has a similar vision, as John is getting to see the new heaven and the new earth, much like Ezekiel was seeing things that pointed to a new era of deliverance, John sees a city. And there's no temple in this city because Jesus is there. But there is a river and there is a tree. It says, then the angel showed me, this is Revelation 22, verse 1, then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Even though seas rage and mountains tumble and mankind makes war and all sorts of things go wrong and things go bad, for God's people, he is always in the midst of her. He is always with her. He is always with the church. And he is always providing like a life-giving river that provides life for the inhabitants around it. And this makes glad. We already mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again. God's protection and his provision do not just dispel fear. They don't just bring a measure of relief. God brings joy. And how powerful to realize that even amidst chaos of humanity's rebellion, even amidst destruction, God brings joy. And he also brings stability in a very unstable world. Instead of roaring waters, we now see raging nations in these verses. Instead of mountains that are trembling, we see kingdoms that are tottering. Natural disasters are terrifying. If you've ever been in a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake, you know how scary natural disasters can be. But far more frightening is when the earth shakes because of mankind's violence. And yet history is marked by the rise and fall of kingdoms. And kingdoms rarely, if ever, rise or fall in any other method than through violence. But even in those times, God is in the midst of his people. And despite the upheaval that is all around us, we shall not be moved. Now, in the Old Testament, there were times that God's people suffered from that violence because of their own rebellion. And this isn't a promise of safety from all physical violence. But it is a promise that we are going to be delivered ultimately. That even if we are to succumb to the violence of man here, as Jesus said, we don't fear those who can kill the body, but instead we fear him who can destroy both body and soul. Even if we die because of man's hatred and man's rebellion and man's violence, we still have a sure city that is the home of God that is promised to us. But not only that, God's people have always continued. Even if individuals obviously pass away, God's people have always remained. For around 2,000 years now, there have been a lot of changes. The Roman Empire has fallen. Many other empires have fallen. If the world stands for long enough, the kingdom that we are a part of, that has been the world power for the last century or so, it will fall at some point. But you know what has never fallen? God's people. The church, as weak as it often appears to mankind, as small and frail as it would look, it has stood. It has stood against violence. It has stood against persecution. It has stood against false doctrine. The church continues. And that's not because of our intelligence or our power or our strength. It's because God is in the midst of his people. And even when evil men threaten, God is a God of deliverance. There's an interesting phrase here, and it says that she shall not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. That's a beautiful picture, and I think that this is an allusion to the timing again of God's drowning Pharaoh's army. We've already mentioned that event And this exact phrase, I understand in Hebrew, is used in that story. In Exodus 14, verse 24, it says that it was in the morning watch. God had parted the Red Sea. The people had crossed over. At some point, he had lifted the wall of fire, allowing Pharaoh and his army in their crazed condition to pursue. And surely in those chariots, they were gaining on the nation of Israel. And you can imagine being some of those people, especially the last ones through, that as the dawn was coming and light was coming enough that you could see, that they could look back and perhaps start to even see those chariots and that army that they could hear behind them. But as the sun rose and it looked like destruction was coming upon them speedily, they watched as that sea crashed back together. And as without any of them having to even lift one hand with the sword, as morning broke, God defeated their enemies. What an incredible morning of deliverance that was. Now, another morning that this could potentially refer to, if it's referring to something specifically, is when God delivered Jerusalem from the Assyrian army. If you remember that story, this is part of why some think that maybe it's during that time. We're told at one point in Isaiah chapter 37 that the armies of Sennacherib had surrounded Jerusalem and they were besieging the city. They'd already conquered many other lands. They'd already destroyed and conquered Israel. They had given threats to Israel or to Judah. But we're told in Isaiah 37 verse 36 that the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. I cannot imagine. I've seen this pictured in TV shows and movies, and it always just chills me to imagine what it must have been like in ancient times to live in a city that was besieged. As your food ran out, as your water ran out, as any time you were brave enough to walk to the walls and look out, you saw an army that was almost beyond comprehension, knowing that at some point they were going to find a way in and kill you. I can't imagine what it must have been like to go to sleep night after night after night, waking up each morning and looking out and seeing that enemy. But one night, Jerusalem went to sleep. And when they woke up, and this is a bit grotesque, but when they woke up and they looked out over the walls, they saw a mass graveyard. They had done nothing except trust in God. And in one night, the angel of the Lord destroyed the army of Sennacherib. Now, one commentator made an interesting point as it talks here about the nations raging, the kingdoms totter, that there's a reference here later to smoke and to fire, that perhaps the only way that, when you think about that scene, how could Jerusalem have even cleaned up that mess? There were 185,000 corpses and horses and chariots and weapons. It's going to talk about in the next part about God breaking the bow and the spear and burning the chariots. How do you clean up an entire army? And commentators said, really, the only option you would have would just be to burn it all away. Would have been quite a grotesque scene. But again, imagine the world superpower, one of their great armies. Every time that the city of Jerusalem looked up and saw the smoke of those burning chariots, they would remember the deliverance of God, who stops wars and who brings an end to destruction. Let's go on to verses 8 through 11. Here the earth and the nations are combined, and God's power is absolute, and it is above all, and the result is his exaltation. Now there is in this passage, in this part, an invitation, and that is to come, behold, It kind of reminds me of Jesus' invitation to his disciples when he said, "Come and see." We are invited to consider and behold the power of God. Now, who is this invitation for? Well, it is for God's people. It's for us to always look to his word and to hear his stories of how he delivers. But I think this is also an invitation to God's enemies to come and to consider his strength, to consider putting aside their rebellion, to take the warning that their doom is certain, and instead to place themselves also in the Lord's protecting care. And again, if this psalm occasioned the defeat of that Assyrian army, what a sight that must have been. I imagine the walls of Jerusalem were filled with people that had come and beheld the Lord's victory. But there is also then a command. He says, "Be still and know." Now that we sing that song, and this is okay, but we sing it sometimes, and I think we take this as a, be still. We think of that as a comforting thing. We desire this stillness. We desire this rest. But this command to be still is not so much an invitation to restfulness. In fact, some translations render this as stop or cease. This is an imperative command. And what it is first of all, to the enemies of God, it is a command to stop their rebellion. It is a command to submit to God, to cease in their sinful ways, and instead acknowledge God for who he is. And for God's people, it is a command to stop our fretting, to stop our panicking, to stop our worrying, and simply to acknowledge God and trust in him for who he is. So this psalm is a psalm of strength and a song of courage. There's one commentator I read said this, and I thought this was very interesting and powerful. He said, "What matters is not whether you have faith, but whether what you have faith in is trustworthy." I think that's right. Because I think at the end of the day, everyone is a person of faith. We all place our faith in something. The question is, does what we have placed our faith in, is it worth it? Does it deserve our faith? And as we look to God, we see that he most certainly is worthy of our faith. I want to end by just looking at a couple of the descriptions, the titles that are given to God. First of all, we are told that he is the Most High. This title refers to God's position. He is above all. It makes me think of Psalm 8, when David is praising God as far above all the earth and the heavens. He is above everything. There is no being, there is no creature, there is no entity that is greater and higher than God. What a marvelous wonder and joy it is then that we can find refuge in the greatest. But also he is called in the refrains the Lord of hosts. This reminds us of God's power. That idea of hosts is he is the God of armies. When you think of a general, you think of a commander, they are really only as strong as their army is. And a general with a great army at his back is a frightening prospect indeed. God is pictured as the God of armies, and that's not the armies of men, that's the armies of the angelic hosts. And consider if one single angel can slay 185,000 soldiers of the world's superpower. Now think of God standing at the head of legions of angels. That is the Lord of hosts who fights for us. But then he is called the God of Jacob. And that might seem like a strange title to throw in with the Most High and the Lord of hosts. But this title, especially to the Israelites, would have reminded them of the peace that comes from belonging to God. God's might and strength benefit and protect his people. And so his position and his power bring peace to those who are in a covenant relationship with him. So this psalm is a song that calls us to confidence and trust And it was true for the Israelites of old, but I think considering who we get to be, who we follow in the New Testament, it is even greater. I just want to close with two promises of Jesus. Matthew 16, verse 18, I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. As members of the Lord's church, we belong to something greater than physical Jerusalem. We belong to the city of God that the gates of hell will never prevail against. In the church, we find a refuge that protects us from all things. Matthew 28, verse 20, behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. The Lord of hosts, God Most High, Jesus, promises his presence among his people for all time. With that, we should find great courage, we should find great joy, we should find great comfort, and we should find great strength to be able to go through this life, whatever difficulties and whatever problems we may face, thanking God always that he is our refuge, he is our fortress, he is our strength. And one day, because of all those things, knowing that we will get to dwell in his city and in his presence forevermore.